Good morning all. My name's Simon Wyatt. I'm a partner at Cundall and a member of the BCO Sustainability Committee. And today we're going to be talking to you about the launch of the BCO's Climate Resilient Workplace Climate Change Risk and Opportunity Report, which has just been published on the website as of this morning. Over the last year, we've seen a real focus on climate change in the media and across the construction industry, but the majority of that focus has been around climate change mitigation and net zero carbon, alleviating the effects of climate change. There has been very little published or work done on dealing with the effects of climate change. We've already seen 1 degree of warming globally, and we have locked in at least another 0.3 degrees. So we are living in a warmer world, and the buildings we're designing at the moment aren't really fit for purpose. So the BCO Sustainability Committee commissioned this piece of research to inform the industry on how they should be tackling this, what design considerations that should they be taken into account, and this seminal piece of work has just been published now. So before we start the presentation, we're just going to do a quick poll. So David, could you bring the poll up? So please, can you fill in the poll on screen? So what is your role in the office sector? Do you currently consider climate change on the projects that you're working on? Climate change adaptation, sorry. Do you see climate change as being adaptation as being important? And what do you think are the current barriers to adaptation? If you can all just take a moment to fill that in. Right, David, I think, can you share the results? Have we got many results in now?
Yeah, about just short of 80% have voted, so I think we'll close it there.
So there's a lot of designers on the call, a few developers and a few contractors. That's a large majority. 83% of designs actually include for climate change adaptation at the moment, and 83% think it is very important. No one's saying it's not very important, and the barriers are pretty evenly spread, but costs coming out as the key barrier to climate change adaptation. Okay, that's very interesting. We did a similar poll of the BCO members before we did this piece of work, which fed into the work, and that correlates very closely with what they fed back. Right, I will now hand over to David, who was the lead researcher on this project. He's a chartered sustainability engineer at Cundall and has helped put together the majority of this report. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Simon. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see me okay, and I hope everyone's keeping safe and well in these well, difficult times. But if there's one thing that we've seen during the COVID crisis, it's been the really extraordinary ability of people, communities and businesses to pull together and adapt on a massive scale to what is a significant threat. So thankfully, it seems we're now starting to emerge out of the other side of this. And as we do this, we need to turn our eyes to the impending crisis, which represents a much greater global threat, environmentally, economically, and socially. As a result of the COVID crisis, the world's CO2 emissions are expected to fall by around 8% this year. And this is roughly in line with the reductions required to meet the Paris Agreement's aspirational temperature limit of a 1.5 degree temperature rise. However, this 8% reduction needs to be maintained year on year for the next decade until we reach zero carbon. So that really gives a sense of the scale of the challenge ahead of us. And the ability to flatten the curve of climate change, both in terms of lessening its impact, but but also in adapting to its effects will require that same collective spirit that we've shown in order to overcome. We already know that our climate is changing, and it already has changed. Average temperatures are currently 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That's a global average. We know that our continued burning of fossil fuels is the cause of this, and the more greenhouse gases we release into the atmosphere, the more the planet will warm. And with our current or pre-COVID emissions, even with current global efforts to reduce emissions that have been pledged by countries around the world, we're still on track for a 3.2 degree temperature rise. And as I mentioned, the Paris Agreement has set an aspirational limit of 1.5 degrees, which is largely agreed to be the temperature limits required to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So you can see globally, even with all the good work that we're doing in the UK and other countries, we're still a way off where we need to be globally. So it's really a huge collective effort that is needed. But put very simply, the higher our emissions, the greater the level of warming we'll see on our planet. And as a result, the greater the risks that this poses. You can see the picture in front of you is showing that climate change is partly a game of risk. We cannot predict the future trajectory of emissions. Politics, economics, technology, population growth, all of these things and other factors are influential, and they're all quite uncertain in themselves. So we can hope that we see a great effort globally to reduce emissions, more towards this lower emission scenario that you can see. But importantly, because we don't know where emissions will go in the future, we can also plan for the worst, and that's really important. And the coloured lines you see in front of you are 4 possible, what are called scenarios of global emissions from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these are used widely in scientific literature to allow exploring a range of different possible climate outcomes and understand what the impacts of each of these are. So these range from a low emission scenario where there's global efforts to reduce emissions, right through to a very high emission scenario where there is little to no effort to reduce emissions. So it's important that we actually consider all of these risks in our designs. So our recommendation is that we should be really designing for a medium emissions scenario, as shown in the sort of yellow or even the orange box as a minimum. But actually it's very important to understand what the risks of a high or a very high emission scenario will be for buildings as well, particularly for critical infrastructure and other high risk projects such as that. But if there is one certainty, it's that our climate will look very different in 30 years' time without drastic mitigation measures. Our seas will be higher than they are now, and this is going to have the effect of substantially reducing the effectiveness of coastal flood defences. So they're just not going to provide the protection that they were designed to in the first place. And in fact, this sea level rise is locked in, so the sea is responding to emissions that have happened over the previous decades. So even with strong efforts to reduce emissions, we will still see a rise in sea levels, which requires adaptation to overcome. Extreme heat waves also, such as that one we saw in 2003 and are seeing on an increasing basis, these will be a very, very regular part of the British climate being experienced every other year. There'll be an overall decrease in rainfall in the summer, and importantly, what little rain does fall will come in shorter, more intense bursts, which leads to greater instances of both drought and flood. And it's quite timely because this looks like it's going to be the driest May on record, following the sunniest April on record as well. And there's obviously the risk that we're already well aware of in the UK that we see a lot of, which is that of winter flooding. And this is just a risk that climate change will only serve to multiply and make much, much worse in the future. And this is obviously only in 30 years' time. The picture in the latter parts of the century is much, much worse as runaway climate change further accelerates. So this is why mitigation is incredibly important, but also adaptation to the damage that has already been done and that we will inevitably see. And that brings me really to one of the key points, which is the importance of efforts for both mitigation and adaptation, and understanding the difference between them. Mitigation, which is largely where the focus in sustainability is at the moment and has been historically, this is about efforts to reduce carbon emissions and prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Adaptation, on the other hand, is actually about taking action to cope with the effects of climate change that will inevitably occur. So essentially, it's about striving for the best, but planning for the worst. And the distinction between them is not always clear. There is often crossover between the two of them, which is something we really are trying to push in this report. And then the term resilience really collectively applies to both of these. It's an organization or a project which is addressing both of these things in tandem. Traditionally, sustainability has referred purely to mitigation, and it's grown over the past decades to finally become a real driving force in the industry. And I think that we're on that same path with adaptation. It's at very, very early days in the industry, but as we begin to see more of the impacts of climate change, we're going to see a growing focus put on adaptation as well. So there's obviously a wide range of stakeholders in the office sector. So the life cycle of the office is broken down into 3 distinct sections, which depend on how the various stakeholders are involved and what their influence is in the office sector. But primarily there's development and investment, which is really those who make money from profit, from property, developers, investors, asset owners. And then there's construction, which is really those who build property and supply materials to those construction projects. And finally, there's the design and operation, those who design and those who occupy property. But there is a lot of overlap within each of these as well, a lot of cross-referencing. So starting with the development and investment, I think it was the CEO of BlackRock who phrased it quite nicely by saying climate risk is investment risk, and anyone who deals in property as an investment is used to dealing with risk. And these really, when it comes to climate, these really exist across 4 key areas, which is value and investment, and how climate change increases the exposure of assets to physical risks, and also increases the cost and reduces their value over time. There's legislative risks as well, where currently there's voluntary reporting of climate risk in property portfolios, but that is likely to become more and more mandatory over time. And then planning policy already includes sections on climate change adaptation, so already there is a mechanism in place for local authorities to ask for increasing adaptation of buildings, and this is something that they're likely to make more stringent over time. And then reputation as well, just as we've seen with change in sentiment towards sustainability and mitigation with net zero carbon, so too are we expecting to see towards climate risk as well. Investors will want to ensure that their assets are climate resilient, as will tenants and other customers as well. And then finally, funding is linked to increasingly stringent ESG criteria, and that includes both mitigation and adaptation as well. So dealing with these risks and being resilient, what this means is acting proactively, not waiting to be caught off guard by external changes or pressures, and then being diligent when choosing investments by ensuring climate risks are being understood and disclosed appropriately and transparently. And then on the other side of this as well, developers should be understanding and disclosing the risks to their own assets and have a plan for these assets and how they can be adapted over time as climate change gets worse. Sustainability is a rapidly changing field as well, changing all the time. So it's only through effective horizon scanning and researching that organizations can get a sense of what the upcoming changes in things such as legislation, industry guidance, and stakeholder expectations might be, so that they can then plan for these. And then often the most effective means of adaptation is not necessarily at a building scale, but at a city or a regional scale, things such as the Thames Barrier. So actually engaging with policymakers on these resilience strategies, which can help protect your own buildings and your own portfolios. So the construction stage as well, this is actually one of the most vulnerable sectors to climate change. It involves the assembly of thousands of materials, dozens of suppliers, hundreds of people working on site, all whilst exposed to the mercy of the weather. So not only are there the physical direct risks from the impact on site operations, operative welfare and safety, and the behavior of construction materials on site, but also from the significant reliance on overseas supply chains. And these international risks are actually thought to be an order of magnitude larger than domestic risks, because it exposes contractors not just to climate change in the UK, but all over the world. So resilience in construction, what this means is having climate-related risks outlined in the contracts. Often contractual clauses contain clauses which cover extreme weather, and they allocate risk to relevant parties, but climate change will alter this risk profile and actually expose contractors more than they might think. So they need to be aware of these risks and aware of this potentially increased exposure and ensure this is properly dealt with. Risks in the supply chain as well need to be understood as far upstream as possible to highlight any areas where this might be vulnerable to overseas impacts, such as in certain geographical regions which might be more prone to climate risks than the UK is, and then taking efforts to actually manage this through diversification or having other contingencies in place for the supply chain. Effective site preparation, such as drainage, material storage, welfare facilities, they become even more important as extreme weather events increase, as does continually planning for extreme weather events to minimize the risk of disruptions. And then an effective environmental management system, which is something that a lot of contractors operate already, but actually it's as much about addressing what the environment's impact on you is, as well as your own impact on the environment. And again, that goes back to that mitigation and adaptation side of things. And there's new standards emerging which can assist organizations with this. And then shifting site operations off-site as well can reduce some of the risks associated with extreme weather. So in the design and operation of buildings as well, it's predominantly design is still based on historic weather data, and this really bears very little resemblance to the climate that we see today, let alone what the building will experience over its life cycle. So, you know, the key risk in that is we're delivering buildings today that are not going to be fit for purpose very quickly in their design life. You know, the increase in heat waves threatens the health and well-being of the people who occupy them. And this has obvious social implications, but also real financial implications for businesses as well. Increasing flood risk, which is already very high in the UK, can cause substantial damage, not only to the fabric of buildings themselves, but also on the ability of businesses to operate, because it can affect the infrastructure that they rely on. And then, of course, buildings which are heavily reliant on comfort cooling may simply become uneconomical to run, and this is expected to be quite a big risk going into the future. So resilience in design and operation, what this means is sustainability target setting, which is becoming increasingly important for organizations. And these targets should really include elements of adaptation, where the briefs ask for future weather and climate data to be used to help clients understand risks and opportunities and help push their design teams to do that. Some of the opportunities to tackle both mitigation and adaptation include passive design measures, so ensuring buildings remain comfortable without consuming excessive energy, and also nature-based solutions as well, which can play a role in increasing adaptation, but also in things such as biodiversity and health and well-being. So really trying to take advantage of these cross-cutting benefits from certain solutions. And then actually having a plan for how a building can be adapted over time. And this really should form part of a building's operating manual. You know, it doesn't need to be retrofitted at some stage in the future. Has that been enabled in the original design as well? And circular economy principles such as flexibility, adaptability, deconstruction, they not only help buildings to adapt to functional changes, but also to changes in climate. You know, as certain areas experience more flooding, then there may be a need to change the use of certain areas of buildings, for example. And then finally, adaptation may be as simple as opting to have a plan for extreme weather, such as relaxing set points or dress codes, without necessarily needing to make major changes to the building. So this is something which building management should be supportive of. So just before we move on to the panel discussion, I'm going to put out another poll for the audience. I'm going to attempt to do that. We'll show whether you are listening or not. Okay. So, do you currently consider climate change adaptation in your projects, noting the difference between adaptation and mitigation? And then what do you see as the biggest climate risks to your organization or projects? So I will give everyone a minute or so to vote on that.
Thanks, David. Just while people answer that, I'll just ask you a couple of quick questions before we go over to the panel. When you were doing the research, what did you find most alarming about what you found?
There's a couple of things really. The first was about, so I think there's a lot of I think the attitude is that if we can drop our emissions very quickly, then we don't have to worry about adaptation. That's something that, you know, might happen in the future, but isn't really a problem. And what really became clear was that we, you know, have already done quite a lot of damage to the climate, and it is already changing in response to that damage. You know, so things like sea level, and you know, these are risks that, irrespective of what happens with global emissions in the future, these are risks that are going to increase. So adaptation is not, you know, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity really, because we have to respond to those risks. And then secondly, it was also, you know, there are bits and pieces in the industry addressing adaptation, but on the whole, there's a lot of misunderstanding about adaptation and how it should be applied, and really I think the industry is very ill prepared for what's coming. So
you think the industry is ill prepared? What do you think the main reason for the ill preparedness is?
I mean, it depends on the perspective, but it's really across the board. You know, there's a lot of good science out there to help understand what the impacts of climate change are going to be in the future. But in terms of translating that into something that is useful for, you know, say designers, for example, or something that is useful for clients to actually help them understand what the risks are, there's a lot of gaps in that area. So it's trying to join the dots, which is something that, you know, this guide is really trying to address there. You know, and we definitely need a lot further guidance for everyone, for clients, for designers, to actually help them implement adaptation in projects.
Interesting. Do you want to share the results of the second poll to see if they differed from the original poll?
Voted there.
Okay, so after David's presentation, we've clearly seen that there's a reduction in people think they're including adaptation in projects already. Before we did the presentation, that was up at over 80%, and now is below 60%, people saying that they're not including it now. In terms of risks, again, there's a fairly even spread, but overheating is perceived as one of the greatest ones. This is very similar to what we saw with the first set of surveys. Flooding doesn't get as much mention, but it's probably going to be the greatest one that the UK is affected with. And it's interesting to see that whenever we do surveys on this, people don't highlight it as being one of their biggest concerns. Okay, we might come back to this. David, if you go on to the next slide. So we're going to go over to the panel discussion now. We've got a panel of experts lined up for you, some really good industry speakers here. So joining David on the panel, we have Ksenia who is a senior lecturer at the Sustainability and Resilience of Urban Planning at Loughborough University, who's doing research to explore the process of disaster risk creation and enhancement underlying systematic implications of sustainability and resilience under the pressure of urbanisation and climate change. So she's in an ideal position to advise on this subject. We've also got Sam, who is the Director of Strategy and Research at Grosvenor, Great Britain and Ireland. Sam is currently focused on creating an innovative capability within Grosvenor and developing Grosvenor's strategy for delivering social and environmental impact. And we also have Eva, who leads Multiplex's net positive strategy, which includes becoming the first contractor with a science-based target endorsed in line with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree aspiration. She's also a member of the BCO committee that commissioned this piece of work. So I'll go first over to Ksenia. So should we be synergizing resilience with climate change adaptation, in your opinion?
Hi, Simon. Yes, absolutely. I think we should and we must. The problem is that resilience, particularly in kind of international and national policy, is very much goes in line with kind of disasters and security, whereas climate change, as David alluded, is very much a kind of sustainability issue, right? So when we divide sustainability and resilience artificially, we therefore create quite a lot of policy tensions, which do not have to be there. So what we see, particularly from disaster point of view, and of course, we know that UK will be most affected by the climate-induced hazards. So that comes together with the disaster risk reduction. So what we see in resilience from disaster risk reduction point of view is that there are lots of tools and different frameworks that actually allow us to deal with climate-induced hazards, but they do not translate into climate change adaptation because they're seen as a completely different kind of subject area, right? So climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, therefore become siloed. And there are issues, you know, resilience very often sees adaptation or vulnerability as a completely different thing. But those bridges can be crossed. So if we are to integrate sustainability and resilience, or resilience and climate change adaptation as a part of sustainability, we will see a much bigger mainstreaming of both issues, and that would allow for efficiency and also cost savings, and of course will help us to avoid duplication.
Is that a problem that governments have created? Do the governments separate them at departmental level?
Yeah, very much so. So, you know, climate change is seen, both mitigation and adaptation, as something kind of that environment departments would deal with. Whereas in the UK, for example, resilience is very much falls under the defense and emergency management.
So they're being completely separated.
Right.
So leading on from that, what is the appropriate scale of integration for resilience, and at what stage of development should it be considered?
Again, I think David alluded to this in his presentations, that every scale is appropriate. So resilience should be considered at all scales, starting from a building as a unit to a neighborhood and community and city and then region, because the issue that we are dealing with here, so climate change or climate-induced hazards that we need to adapt to, doesn't know borders, right? So when disaster unfolds or when climate change affects everything and everyone. So we need to look at scales in its integrity and kind of in a much more holistic approach. And to do that, we really need to think about climate change adaptation measures as early in a project as possible. So, you know, if it was kind of my choice, I would say that anyone and everyone need to consider climate change adaptation measures when the sheet is still blank, right? So right at the concept stage of any development, because we know, we have evidence that the later we consider climate change adaptation measures in the project, the more expensive and less effective they become. So they will kind of just be a bolt-on, but wouldn't really solve anything.
So who would you say are the main stakeholders in the built environment?
So again, everyone, starting from the owners and investors, and then those who are actually creating the built environment. So urban planners, architects, designers, contractors, engineers, kind of across the board. So everyone needs to think about it, but in order for them to be informed, we really need to mainstream the ideas of resilience and climate change adaptation in the education and professional development, because at the moment, everybody sort of touched upon it, but no one really kind of invests in educating about climate change adaptation.
Okay, really interesting. Before I go over to Sam, I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A session for David or any of the other panelists, and we'll pick those up after we do the panel discussion. So over to Sam from Grosvenor. So at the moment, do you as an organisation consider climate change adaptation when you're selecting sites or costing site selection?
Yes, we do. I guess the context though is that we're both an investor and a developer, and our investment portfolio is probably where 90% of our capital is tied up and is largely concentrated in the historic part of the West End of London. So, I think applying adaptation to our existing portfolio, many of which of our buildings are over 200 years old, is a huge part of the challenge. But when we are looking at new sites, we're absolutely looking at what's likely to happen in terms of, for example, flood risk over the next 20, 30 years under the different climate scenarios. And there are more tools available to allow us to do that now. But to a large extent, we have to work with what we've already got. And you can't move those buildings, so you have to work out how you adapt them in their current setting.
Great, thank you. And one thing that David kind of alluded to, but didn't go into much detail, was there seems to be a lot of movement around investment at the moment in terms of climate risk with things like GRESB and the Task Force for Financial Disclosure. Do you currently report to either of these? And if so, can you just give us a summary of the process that's involved?
So in my part of the business in GBI, we don't report to GRESB, although our European business does for some elements. But we are now looking at TCFD. In fact, we've committed this year within the UK business to start reporting against the TCFD framework over the next couple of years. And it is quite a substantial task. And I think my sense is that a lot of people, either people aren't particularly aware of it, or everyone's kind of at quite an early stage on the learning curve. So we have recently commissioned some external advisors to come up with some future climate scenarios for the various cities that we're in. And this includes our global business. So, we're looking at what the long-term, impact of climate change could be in places like Vancouver and San Francisco, as well as in London. But I think as we get into it, the more obvious it becomes that this is an area that we really need to collaborate on. It doesn't make sense for every property owner in London to be commissioning their own set of scenarios, for example, ultimately. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to work together on that stuff. But we do see it as something that's going to grow, and it ultimately will be very helpful, because what it starts to do is allow you to put more kind of financial implications on some of these outcomes, which, whilst they might be quite scary when you have to start reporting on them, I think it does help to address some of the issues I think came up in one of the questions earlier about cost as a barrier. Is like, at the moment, people see the cost, but they don't see the implication of not doing anything. I think things like TCFD will start to make that much clearer.
Thanks for that, Sam. For those of you who aren't familiar with TCFD, it was started by the Bank of England, Mark Carney instigated it, and Bloomberg now chair it. So it's pretty much moved through the entire investment world, and it's going not just through the construction industry, it's going through all sectors that they have to report against climate risk. So as Sam alluded to, if you're not doing this, there might be some financial penalties. You might not be able to secure investment. So it's something that everyone really needs to start considering. Sam, do your supply chain currently consider climate change adaptation in your opinion? And if not, do you know why they don't?
Well, I think my general view on this is that it's incumbent on us as the kind of developer and investor to tell our supply chain what we want from them. What is a combination of us and the legislative environment. So frankly, if we don't ask them for it, they're not going to give it to us. And so one of the things we've done in the last couple of years on a more broad basis was we've implemented a supply chain charter, which covers a whole range of stuff, not just climate change, but things like modern slavery and living wage and those sorts of things, that makes clear the kind of standards that we expect from our supply chain across a number of bases. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to be doing in order to make sure that our supply chain don't just feel they have to give us the lowest price, because they do that, we're not going to get all those extra features as well. I mean, I think it's really important, as has been said already, that, you know, the mitigation and the adaptation piece is considered as a piece, because, you know, you need the supply chain to understand which of those are your priorities and how much of them you want. And I would say, and I'm pleased that we've got a lot of design-based people on the call, because I think of the whole supply chain, I think getting the design piece right is absolutely critical. And if you don't get that right, whatever you do with the rest of the supply chain is kind of secondary. I think the other piece of the broader supply chain that I would probably want to call out a little bit is on the valuation side, because I think my sense is in general the valuation part of our industry really needs to catch up on this stuff. I would, you know, it might be slightly unfair, but I'd characterize a lot of what goes on in valuation as quite sort of extrapolation from history / comparison with what's going on now. I don't feel like many people in the valuation space have really looked hard at, you know, what is going to happen to the value of buildings in 20 or 30 years time under some of these more pessimistic climate scenarios. And again, you know, getting that right will really help crystallize what it's actually worth investing today to avoid some of those outcomes in the future.
And I understand that Grosvenor is an international company, a global company. How would you say the UK compares to other areas of the world? Would you say we're on top of this or behind?
I'd say certainly within our company, we're probably ahead, and that's partly because we started as a UK-centric business, so we've just got more critical mass in the UK. But I think it's also partly a reflection of the kind of policy emphasis put on it. So I think in the UK, certainly compared to North America, I think we're in a good place relatively.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam. Going over to Eva. So as a main contractor, what are the risks to you as a business?
Good afternoon, everyone. Brilliant to be part of this event today, and very proud for Multiplex to have sponsored this fantastic new report. The top risks, Simon, I would say it's the weather, for sure. It will disrupt construction more and more due to high winds, flooding, conditions that are too cold or too hot for people to work, and for things like concrete to cure, and unproductive site offices. Another one that is coming for sure is the scarcity and high prices for materials and water. And communities in our global supply chain face adversities and become even more vulnerable to exploitation. That's another big risk. Also, if we don't act quickly enough, there will be higher reporting as well as taxation costs. And public health, locally and globally, suffers due to pollution caused by construction sites. So current plant and equipment and power sources are becoming redundant, or will be very soon.
Interesting. And in terms of your response about weather and extreme weather affecting sites, are you actually starting to do anything about that at the moment in Multiplex? Do you actually plan for more extreme weather? Do you add an allowance onto your programs? Is there anything you do for that?
Yes, we have. At Multiplex, we appreciate the challenges, and we flip those risks on their head with our net positive strategy that aims to be restorative. Because it is the right thing to do and also makes our business more resilient. We have 5 pillars, so we want to be positive, have a positive climate impact, zero waste and circular economy, net positive on biodiversity and air quality, responsible supply chains free from modern slavery, and building in sustainability and well-being from the outset. As part of that, we do recognize that we have been winded off for periods of time, for example, last year, and that had very measurable impacts. So we have now linked weather forecasts to our data warehouse, which allows us to plan better. We have also done things, like you mentioned, for the risk of flooding. So we have enhanced now our water management plans for the sites. Another big issue is temperature. So we use the insights we have gained through multiplex operations in the Middle East and in Canada. So we take an approach, I would say, based on the hierarchy of controls, primarily to prevent the impact on people. So for working in the heat, we use cold rooms in the Middle East, to just give you a glimpse or a flavor, where people take breaks and drink cold water with electrolytes to cool down and avoid dehydration. And we mix ice in the concrete mix, and we tend to pour at night where temperatures are lower. We also are using an innovative, relatively innovative method for the construction industry. For sure is innovative. It's what's called the thermal work limit tool, which measures a number of things. As we know, the heat stress is quite complex. So it measures temperature as well as humidity and wind speed. And on our construction sites, this tool sends alerts to our managers to adapt their work according to multiplex protocols. For working in extremely cold weather, we use an equivalent procedure, but for cold, to break up the work, reduce exposure on the workers, use also appropriate PPE, and for concrete pours, we insulate the slabs and we heat them so the curing happens correctly.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Yes, our climate is changing, but it's changing to be similar to other regions of the world. So we can definitely learn from the rest of the world. As David and Sam alluded to, one of the biggest impacts is going to be on supply chains and materials. So as a main contractor, are you looking at the risk to your supply chain and trying to de-risk that with them?
Yes, for sure. We take a people-centric approach, and our supply chains are absolutely paramount. On construction sites in specific, what we have done is we have launched a pioneering standard for all sizes of construction sites that we work on, which is based on the well building standard. So it brings in all the well-being elements, as well as cutting edge sustainability and health and safety measures. I would say that the standard includes three very specific nature-based solutions. I know you mentioned nature-based solutions earlier, which is natural ventilation, natural materials, and natural light, which I think the importance of which have become even more prevalent now with COVID-19. But we are taking other measures as our supply chains are local as well as global. So how we work with them has global, if I may say, implications. So with climate change, people around the world lose their livelihoods, unfortunately, and may fall prey to exploitation. So as a responsible principal contractor, we help prevent exploitation in local and global supply chains through the management systems we implement and use. So we have launched an ethical labor management system with 9 clear principles for fair recruitment and payment, reinforcing workers' rights and the workers' voice, which is very important. We are also
Go on.
We are also taking steps on our dependence on scarce raw materials and water, because with climate change, we will see those becoming too expensive and the supply chains at risk for unpredictable disruptions like we've seen now with COVID-19. So we are working with the supply chain to implement solutions like those mentioned earlier. So we are investing in low embodied carbon, low embodied water materials, offsite manufacturing, as well as circular economy. So systems to help us reduce waste and actively promote materials with high recycled content and materials in closed loops, from closed loops, similarly with water efficiency.
Thanks, Eva. I'm just going to throw the questions open to the floor now. We've got a few come in, but if anyone else has any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. Also, whilst we've got people here, a lot of you have indicated that you're doing climate adaptation on projects. So if you, on the chat box, if you want to write what adaptation measures you're doing, it would be very interested to see that. So where are you using adaptation on your projects? If you could write just a line or a quick message on that, so we can talk about that as well. So one of the questions that's come in from Debbie Hobbs is, will climate adaptation mean that sealed glass boxes become the white elephant of the future? What will building owners do with these now they don't have openable windows? So I'll go to David first on that.
Yeah, I mean that's quite an interesting one, because it's the sealed glass office, you know, that will become the most at risk of effectively becoming obsolete in the future because it's too expensive to run. You know, those that are designed when energy is cheap and plentiful, and you know, and those are certainly at risk, but also they have the dual pressure really, because not only are they very, very difficult to adapt to a changing climate, but they're also not really compatible with the mitigation trajectory that we want to see. So, you know, the sealed glass office block, if we're going to hit our 2050 net zero target, has to become a thing of the past, which with much more considered facade design, much more sensible, you know, amounts of glass and natural ventilation. So they really do face those dual pressures there. So, and you know, in terms of what building owners do with these, we're seeing a lot of people who are interested in working out what the building's trajectory is for achieving net zero carbon. So if they don't have opening windows now, it doesn't necessarily mean they can't have opening windows in the future. That facade will eventually reach the end of its life. So that may be retrofit to actually make it more efficient, but at the same time, it's also going to be able to cope much better with the effects of climate change as they become more and more pronounced.
Does anyone else want to come in on that point? Sam, do you, Grosvenor, have a policy on glazing or glazing areas?
I mean, I wouldn't want to go into too much on specifics, but I guess it's part of this broader question of the taking account of both the mitigation and the adaptation in all the design decisions we make. So, you know, I'm particularly keen on driving out the embodied carbon in our developments as well as the adaptation point. So trying to get to the best way of dealing with all those things. And as I say, the very significant challenge we have with, particularly with a lot of listed period buildings and trying to retrofit those. And that's where you actually often come into conflict with either heritage constraints or some of the fire regulation stuff as well. So I think there's a kind of challenge around getting all the different elements of the policy environment lined up to allow you to do the right thing.
Thanks. Another question for potentially David and Ksenia is, what is a risk-based approach to design? What does that mean? David, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned in the earlier, it's when we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with the uncertainty of what might happen in the future. We may drastically drop our emissions, in which case the risks posed by climate change are going to be less, the impacts will be less, or you know, we may not globally, in which case those impacts are going to be a lot more. So a risk-based approach really involves using these scenarios and using them as a tool to actually explore these different potential futures of a building. So rather than potentially over designing now by adding in, additional comfort cooling or oversizing comfort cooling, which it kind of goes backwards in terms of the net zero trajectory. It's actually understanding what possible outcomes there might be for the building, and then both identifying measures that can be used to adapt to that, but also identifying when that might happen. So, temperatures may reach, they may be 2 degrees hotter in 10 years time, in which case you identify that as the point where you retrofit those measures that are needed, which you've originally designed in anyway to happen, or maybe that happens in 50 years time. So that then becomes part of the sort of the adaptation plan for the building. But you can only get that through a risk-based approach where you're identifying all of these possible outcomes.
Thanks, David. Ksenia, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what David said, and in order to really be able to identify risks and assess them, it's important that lots of people are sitting around the table and talking about them, right? Because from our perspective, say as architects or urban planners, we would only be able to see particular risks. Developers may see different risks or see the risks differently. So it's about sort of finding this trade-off, and different opinions. But also, I think what we really need to think about now in terms of risk assessment and design, risk-informed design, is that we need to think about multi-hazard approach to the way we design things and assess risks, because very often what we design to address one hazard actually has a detrimental effect when another hazard comes. And we see that a lot now with overheating and kind of moisture and things like that.
Thank you. Just seeing on the chat, quite a few people are mentioning that they're using future weather files from CIBSE to do their overheating analysis, which is probably one of the main areas we've seen in the industry look to use scenario planning for design. Just a note on that, they are really good scenarios, but they are based on the old climate change scenarios are not actually up to date at the moment. CIBSE, I'm the chair of the Knowledge Generation Panel, and CIBSE are actually looking to update those at the moment. So again, they're probably the best thing we've got in the industry, but they're not up to date. Another one that people have mentioned is on flooding, adding allowances, but again, those are based on rules of thumb, not on climate science. Could just go to one question which seems to have come in for Sam, which is, with TCFD reporting starting to affect design teams, does that mean we're going to be changing the key performance indicators on projects? Is that something you started to do?
It almost certainly will do, yeah. So for those who aren't close to it, TCFD has kind of 4 main buckets to it. There's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So the metrics and targets bit of that is about reporting on and disclosing the metrics and targets that you're using to assess and manage your relevant climate related risks. So you can kind of see immediately from that there's going to be a flow down from the likes of us to our supply chain to make sure that we're measuring the right stuff. And it's something we're learning as we go along, but you can see it's absolutely going to have an impact on what we're required to report on externally, and therefore what we're going to need our supply chain to help us with.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to start coming with the investment market changing. Derek Clemes has put a note about natural daylight, and completely agree. We need to be designing buildings to maximize natural daylight, but maximize does not always mean full height. The best metrics for daylight are useful daylight index, which is basically trying to find that optimum level. So you can have too much and too little daylight. So facades for net zero carbon should be designed to be at that sweet spot, which is generally around about 40 to 60% glazing from the outside rather than that full height glass. Another question coming in regarding building values. There seems to be quite a few questions on building values, on the fact that there's requirements to decarbonise the building stock in accordance with the net zero carbon strategy for the government. What is that going to do to asset values? Anyone particularly want to come in on that?
I mean, that's something that we've been trying to wrap our head around. As I said earlier, I think the standard kind of industry approach to valuation is kind of miles off this at the moment. I came into property as a non-surveyor, and I came in with a little bit of a corporate finance background, so I've always tried to run kind of cash flow based appraisals, and we also do quite a bit of risk simulation around that. So, but trying to work out, what's the potential risk and spread of outcomes in you say even like a 25-year cash flow model, because of course, property always has been by its nature a long-term investment. So you're always trying to look quite a way into the future. And, one of the things we're having to start do now is trying to work out, what's going to happen in terms of, if a building becomes uninsurable, or if you move away from the energy performance rating certificates we have now, which aren't a particularly good way of measuring actual performance, to a more accurate measure, and then government legislation changes and carbon taxes come in, you can start to see a whole range of things that could currently don't have a direct financial impact, but could quite easily do so within 10 years or so. And given how low interest rates are and are likely to continue to be, things that are even happening 20, 25 years in the future have quite a big impact on the net present value of those calculations. So I think it's a really big challenge. We're trying to look at it, but I've not seen anyone yet who's really cracked it.
Yeah, I think everyone's really starting to look at it. I think it's going to start really driving the industry over the next couple of years, really looking at the actual assets. I'm working with a few clients now that have actually asked us to look at carbon costs when procuring buildings and sites. So they're actually looking at a building and saying, how much is this going to cost to bring it in line with where we need to be, and taking that off the value of the property when they're looking to buy it. So it's definitely coming through the market, which is a really great step. All right, I'm just looking at time. David, can you bring up the final couple of slides so we can just finish up? Before I do, I'd just like to thank our speakers for today. So obviously David in his presentation, all the panelists, obviously Grosvenor and Multiplex for sponsoring the event as well. The next BCO event that is due is on to the 10th of June, which is about from the Urban Affairs Group on the future of cities in the age of AI. They shall probably add climate change on there as well and adapt into it. So how does AI help you adapt to climate change in the future? Okay, thank you everyone for attending. And those of you who we didn't answer your questions, we will try and get those out by email. The report is now available to download, so please get onto the BCO website and do so. Thank you all.